That's great. Okay. Well, before we get into the second talk, could I just mention, and I don't know that I've got copies up here, but hopefully you will have found on your seats a copy of our prayer letter, the Biblical Creation Trust prayer letter. Do feel free to take a copy with you. There are also some back copies on the table, the book table at the back. Do feel free to help yourselves to those. And if you're not already on our mailing list, I know some of you are, but if you're not already on our list and would like to be added, fill in the little white slip, which hopefully is also on your seat. We send it out by post and also by email, and just hand that back to me at the end, and I'll make sure that we sign you up to get our newsletter. There's a really interesting, exciting project that we're working on at the moment, which is to establish a creationist study centre in Cambridge. This has been a vision of ours for a while. We've been thinking strategically about how we reach students and how we train and mentor the next generation, those who are going to be Christian leaders in academia, maybe even creationist leaders in the future, and finding ways to sort of get alongside those young people and help them and train them and help them through university. So that's what we're doing. My colleague Dr. Stephen Lloyd recently relocated to Cambridge. We've begun a series of student meetings which have been very encouraging, where we meet together with students, have a meal, have a discussion about a different topic each time. But we've got big plans. We've got plans to sort of establish a whole sort of study centre there in Cambridge. And if you'd like to find out more about that, it's covered in your prayer letter. There are also some leaflets on the table at the back that are about the Cambridge House project. So do take one of those and have a read about that. Okay. So in our first talk, we looked at some of the reasons why creation really matters theologically. But I ended by saying this raises all kinds of scientific questions, of course. If the Bible storyline really is incompatible with evolution and an ancient Earth, then what do we do with all of the mountains of scientific evidence which are said to support these ideas? And so I want to spend a bit of time in this second talk thinking about the scientific evidence. Now, what I'm not going to try to do is to answer all of your questions, because even if I could, and I'm sure there are questions I couldn't answer, but even if I could, we wouldn't have time. This is such an enormous subject. So instead, what I want to do is describe an approach, a methodology that I think can help us when we're faced with these kinds of scientific questions. And I want to illustrate it with some specific examples as well. I want to set the scene, first of all, by acknowledging how compelling evolutionary theory really is. Perhaps you didn't expect a creationist to say that this evening, but sometimes you'll hear creationists speak very dismissively about evolution and an old Earth. I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake if we dismiss the evidence too lightly, or give the impression that it's sort of foolish to believe in evolution. And the reason is that evolution seems to be supported by a very wide spectrum of evidence, scientific evidence, drawn from many different scientific disciplines. And you can see some of those disciplines sort of here on the slide that appear to converge on this explanation, this evolutionary explanation. And in fact, I think one of the strongest arguments for evolution is not any particular piece of evidence, but it's what the philosophers of science refer to as consilience. It's the consilience, the agreement of evidence from many different sub-disciplines that seems to converge on this same explanation. And I think this helps to explain why evolution can seem so compelling to intelligent and thoughtful people. But we also need to understand that because a scientific theory seems to be supported by a wide range of evidence, that does not mean that it's necessarily correct. Now, this is sometimes, I think, a difficult concept for people to grasp. We may have this sort of rather simplistic notion that if an idea is false, that there can't be any evidence in its favour. But actually, that's not really how the real world works, and it's not how science works. In science, multiple theories can sometimes explain the same data, the same evidence, and we may have to do some very careful work to try to determine which of those explanations is in fact correct. And the history of science is littered with theories that had a broad range of evidential support, but which turned out to be wrong and were ultimately replaced by better theories. An obvious example is geocentrism, the idea that the Earth is fixed and stationary at the centre of our solar system. And this idea was accepted by virtually all thinking people in the Western world, probably for the best part of 1,600 years. In terms of longevity, it's probably the most successful scientific idea there has ever been. By contrast, evolution, according to natural selection, has only been around for 160 years. It's a newcomer compared to an idea like geocentrism. And one of the reasons geocentrism was so well accepted was because it just explained the evidence. You only need to look up at the sky and you can see the motions of the heavens around the fixed Earth. It was just self-evidently true. And in fact, it took maybe 150 years for scientists like Copernicus ultimately to replace geocentrism with heliocentric models, sun-centered models of the solar system. In fact, heliocentrism isn't really correct either, because the sun is not a fixed point. These are sort of arbitrary reference points, really. So theories can be compelling, they can be supported by lots of data, lots of observational data, but they can be wrong. So, what should be our approach today when we are confronted with a scientific idea like evolution that seems to conflict with the Bible? Well, a number of things to say. I mean, firstly, of course, we have to ask whether we've correctly interpreted the Bible. We can get our biblical interpretations wrong. We're not guaranteed infallibility in our understanding of Scripture. And there are occasions when evidence from outside the Bible can legitimately cause us to go back to the Bible and say, have I really understood this correctly? You know, have I got this right? I think the problem arises when science is allowed to control our interpretation of the Bible. When science is allowed to overturn well-established biblical teaching of the kind I hope I sort of presented in the first talk. Because when science controls our interpretation, then we're not really interpreting the Bible at all. We're allowing science to dictate to us what the Bible must mean, and that's not biblical interpretation. So let me illustrate that. So if you come to the Bible believing that evolution is a fact, that physical death has been around for hundreds of millions of years, well, logically, when you read passages like Romans 5 or 1 Corinthians 15, they cannot be teaching that physical death came through Adam's sin. They just can't mean that if evolution is true, if you want to retain the veracity of the Bible, you would be forced to conclude that physical death was not the result of Adam's sin. You'd be forced to maybe say, well, this is just spiritual death or something of that kind. But that is not interpreting the Bible. That is allowing science to control, to dictate what the Bible is saying. And that leads to the second point, which is that very often the way this works is it's like a ratchet where it only moves in one direction. So science is allowed to challenge our interpretation of the Bible, but our interpretation of the Bible is never allowed to challenge our scientific interpretations. And again, I think that's a mistake. I think we have to allow the Bible to challenge the scientific consensus when that is necessary. And I would say that in this case, this is necessary because we've looked at well-established biblical teaching, drawn from many passages of Scripture throughout the whole Bible, where we have these aspects of the biblical storyline that conflict with evolution and an old earth, and they don't concern peripheral matters. They concern things like the person and the work of Christ, the meaning of the atonement, what the cross is about, what resurrection is about. So in those cases, I think we have to give the Bible the ability to push back against the scientific consensus. Now, of course, when we do that, we make our position vulnerable. And this is where Christians can get very, very nervous. Because what we're doing, when we challenge the scientific consensus, we're saying, here is something that can be tested. And we are vulnerable to our ideas, our biblical interpretation being disproved. A couple of things about that. If what we say, if we're concerned so that what we say can never be tested against physical reality, against scientific evidence, why should anybody listen to what we have to say? It's actually our vulnerability that makes the Christian message so compelling. I mean, think about the resurrection. Think about how Paul proclaimed the resurrection, and he said, if Christ is not raised, your faith is in vain. He made his position on the resurrection vulnerable to disproof. Because if somebody went out and found that the tomb was occupied and could show that Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, well, Paul says you may as well give up and go back to what you were doing before. He made his position vulnerable, but that made the message really compelling. It actually has purchase in the real world. So yes, I think there is this vulnerability that comes with challenging the scientific consensus, but that's what makes what we have to say worth hearing. Consider a parallel example from the discipline of archaeology. For many years there was a consensus among academic archaeologists that the Old Testament king, David, was a fictional character, that he never existed. There was no evidence that he ever existed. And that was the consensus. So what did evangelical Christians do? Well, to their credit, what they didn't do was say, well, of course, we just need to reinterpret the Bible to accommodate the non-historicity of David. They didn't do that, at least most of them. No, they said, look, the historicity of David is very well established in the Bible, and it's important. It's important for our understanding of the story of redemption. They were not willing to let that truth go. And so what did they do? Well, they did more research. They waited patiently for new discoveries, for new answers to come along. And in 1993, their patience was rewarded with the discovery of a tablet at Tel Dan in northern Israel, dated to the mid-8th century BC and bearing an inscription that refers to the house of David. There, in this tablet, was the first archaeological confirmation of the historicity of King David. And it vindicated the Bible's claims about David's historicity. Now, I think that creation and the flood are so clear in the Bible that we ought to take a similar approach in this case as well. When it comes to scientific claims about evolution and the age of the earth, I think we need to be doing more research. We need to be asking good questions. We need to be patient. We need to be looking for new interpretations of the data, not simply sort of rolling over and saying, let's accommodate the Bible to whatever the current scientific consensus is. Now, of course, some people will say evolution is just a completely different case. That evolution and an old Earth are so well supported scientifically that it's impossible even to conceive of an alternative explanation for the evidence. Well, frankly, I think that kind of thinking is lazy and unscientific. How will we ever know whether an alternative explanation is possible unless we're willing to put in the hard effort to look? Every discarded scientific theory was once considered to be the best way, perhaps the only way, to understand the evidence. But they ended up consigned to the dustbin of history because somebody thought it was worth exploring further. Now, somebody might say, surely we've already been there and done that. Creationism surely is an old idea from the past that was checked out by previous generations and it didn't work. It was tried before Darwin. It's just a kind of failed idea from the past. But again, I think that's mistaken. The truth is that creationism has never been seriously tried as a professional, multidisciplinary research enterprise until actually quite recently. Serious scientific research from a creationist perspective is actually rather new. And I want to suggest that today we live in quite exciting times. So I think there's a bit of a delay with the slides. Could we just go back to the previous slide, please? That's it. Lovely. We live today at a time where there's a growing community of scientists, students, scholars who are dedicated to building scientific models based on the biblical framework of history. This is an incredibly ambitious project. It's a project that in many ways has hardly begun. But this work is happening, and the kinds of people that are doing this work are not well-meaning amateurs. These are people who are scientifically trained, who have reputable PhDs from well-known universities in relevant scientific disciplines. And you can see some of them in this slide. Let me mention just a couple of them. Firstly, Dr. Kurt Wise. This is Kurt. Sorry, did I click the wrong button? There we are. This is Kurt down here in the lower right. Kurt is a paleontologist, an expert in fossils. He got his PhD at Harvard, where he was studying under one of the world's leading evolutionary biologists of the time, Professor Stephen Jay Gould. And over a number of decades now, Kurt has been at the forefront of developing creationist theories about the fossil record, about systematics, the science of classification and so on. He's an expert in the area that he's dealing with. Another of these creationists is Todd Wood. He was mentioned earlier because he's my colleague who co-hosts the Let's Talk Creation podcast. This is Todd here looking at these hominin bones. Todd is a biochemist. He got his PhD at the University of Virginia. He served as the director of bioinformatics for the Clemson University Genomics Institute. And today he's active in creationist research, undertaking research in a number of different areas and also sort of training and mentoring other creationist scholars. And there are many other examples like this. Now, in drawing attention to these scientists, I'm not trying to argue from authority. I'm not trying to just impress you with credentials. Compared to the evolutionary community, we are still a very small and insignificant community of people. But the point I want to make is that you can't dismiss these kinds of scientists as just sort of ignorant know-nothings, people who don't understand anything about science. They have some first-hand familiarity with the data. They understand how the data's interpreted. They understand the problems within their own disciplines. And they've come to believe that alternatives to evolution and to deep time are worth exploring. We have to take these scientists seriously, I think. And these scientists have been doing real science. One particular focus of creationist research over recent decades has been the geology of the Grand Canyon in Arizona. Almost 30 years ago now, geologist Dr. Steve Austin published this book, Grand Canyon, A Monument to Catastrophe, which described creationist research there in Grand Canyon. Much more has been done since the book came out. I think at some point there's going to be an updated edition. And creationists are working together in collaborative ways to solve difficult problems for the creationist model. You see, we need scientists with different expertise in different fields working together, because no one scientist can be an expert in everything. We need a cross-disciplinary effort. One of those multidisciplinary teams was the RATE project. It stands for Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth. It was a team of creationists who had expertise in physics and geology and geophysics, who came together to tackle the problem of radiometric dating, the methods that geologists use to assign ages of millions and billions of years to rock samples. And they came up with some really interesting results. We also have our own professional societies to help to promote and facilitate this kind of research. The oldest is the Creation Research Society, which was founded back in the 60s, has over 700 members and publishes a quarterly journal. There's also the Creation Biology Society, the Creation Geology Society for creationists who have expertise in those disciplines. They hold an annual conference together. And another interesting aspect of all of this work is how much of this creationist research ends up being published in secular scientific journals and presented at mainstream scientific conferences. Many people are completely unfamiliar with this. They're not aware that it's going on. But many creationists are interacting with their non-creationist peers in these kinds of forums. That they may be circumspect about their creationist worldview with their scientific colleagues, but the work that they're doing is, stands up to peer review among their colleagues. One good example is the work of creationist Dr. Leonard Brand and his colleagues, who have been studying for a number of years a remarkable graveyard of fossil whales in Peru. And they've published a number of articles in the secular literature on the evidence that these whales were rapidly buried in extraordinary circumstances because of the remarkable preservation of the skeletons. Their work was even featured on the front cover of Geology, which is one of the world's leading geological journals published by the Geological Society of America. Much of the work that I did with colleagues in North America studying the Coconino Sandstone in Grand Canyon was presented at annual meetings of the Geological Society of America, and we've also published a number of papers in not only the creationist literature but also in mainstream journals too. So there's lots of really interesting creationist research going on. But of course there are some objections, potential objections or pitfalls that we need to think about. One of these objections to creationist research concerns the problem of bias. People will sometimes say to us, how can you interpret the scientific data in an unbiased way when you're beginning by assuming the truth of the Bible? In other words, because we're already committed to the Bible's account of origins, the suggestion is that we've sort of surrendered our scientific objectivity. We've already decided what the answers are going to be. Well, it's an interesting point. It's one that we do need to think about. But I think the thing to remember is that bias is not a uniquely creationist problem. It's a human problem. All of us have a philosophical framework, a worldview, religious presuppositions, biases that we bring to our study of the real world. We can't escape it. If science was closed to people who had pre-existing worldviews, nobody would be doing science. Think about Richard Dawkins, the famous evolutionary biologist, atheist. He said something very interesting in The Blind Watchmaker, his famous book. He said, even if there were no actual evidence in favour of the Darwinian theory, there is of course, he says, but even if there wasn't, we should still be justified in preferring it over all rival theories. It's a very interesting comment, isn't it? Why does he say that? Well, because he has a worldview. He is committed to philosophical naturalism, the idea that the world of nature, matter and energy, that's all there is. There is nothing else. Well, if that's your worldview, something like evolution has to be true. A priori, before you ever go and look at the evidence. Something like evolution has just got to be true. You see, the truth is we all have our own biases. We can't escape them. And the answer to bias is to recognize that it's a problem for all of us. I think one of the biggest problems is when people think that bias is something that only afflicts other people. It afflicts creationists, but we're objective. Well, that's a problem. We all have to recognize our biases, and we need some kind of strategy to deal with bias. We need peer review. We need to seek critical input from other scientists who perhaps have different worldviews. They can point out where we have blind spots. We can maybe point out where they have blind spots. And this is good for the health of science, for people with these different perspectives to work together. Another potential pitfall or objection concerns the question of miracles. Some people dismiss creationism from the outset because it invokes supernatural causes. And they say that's just a science showstopper. As soon as you invoke miracles, we're kind of outside the realm of science. Now, it's certainly true that we can't study miracles in the laboratory. Okay? God doesn't perform miracles to order. And God himself is a spirit, and we can't detect him in the laboratory. There's no laboratory test, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that creationism isn't scientific, because scientific evidence can point to a miracle having occurred. Consider, for example, one of the biblical miracles, the miracle of the water into wine at the wedding at Cana in Galilee. Now imagine you were a scientist at the wedding and you were able to take a sample from the jars just before the miracle happened, and then you also took a sample immediately after the miracle. You could analyze it in your laboratory. You may well come to the conclusion something really strange happened. Something really that I can't explain happened in those jars. Or consider the resurrection of Jesus. As Christians, we believe that the best explanation of the historical evidence is that Jesus really rose from the dead. There are certain historical facts that we can't explain otherwise. So evidence can point towards a miracle. Now, of course, as creationists, if what we want to do is to do good science, we've got to come up with specific claims which are amenable to scientific testing. So some claims, while they may be true, they're not very useful scientifically. So I could say, well, the claim God exists. Okay? It's true, God exists. But how can I test that scientifically? But if I can come up with a specific claim about the origin of this particular fossil, or the origin of this particular rock layer, or the age of this rock layer, those are claims that can be scientifically tested. And in fact, our critics acknowledge the fact that creationism makes scientific claims every time they present a scientific argument against creationism. So here's an example from a secular journal where we've got an article written by an evolutionist who is comparing the creationist interpretation of a particular fossil with the evolutionary interpretation. And he's using this article to sort of test these two competing explanations of the evidence. Now here's the thing. You can't offer scientific arguments against something that is not a scientific claim. Right? So you can't, as some people try to do, you can't say, well, creationism is untestable and unscientific, and here's all the evidence against creationism. You can't have it both ways. Either it's untestable, in which case you have no arguments to offer against it, or it's making scientific claims. And I think creationism is making scientific claims, and I think they can be tested. So, what's the kind of approach then? What should our methodology be as we sort of try to make sense of the scientific evidence? I think we can sum it up in this phrase, which I think Joshua used earlier. He talked about building models, model building. Lots of creationists spend most of their time attacking evolution, poking holes in evolutionary arguments, in evolutionary explanations. And there's a place for that, of course. There is a place for critiquing false ideas. There's a place for that. But if that's all that we do, that's actually quite unsatisfying in the long run. Because you know how human nature is. People will cling to bad ideas until you give them a better idea to replace it. Okay? Any shelter in a storm, right? That's how human nature is. So if we can build our own scientific models that explain the scientific evidence better than the competing evolutionary models, that is a really powerful apologetic. So what do we mean by a scientific model? Well, you can think of a scientific model as a kind of conceptual framework a sort of story that tries to explain our observations of the natural world, that tries to bring together many observations, a broad range of data, showing how all those bits of data relate to one another and fit together. It's a bit like solving a crime. You know, imagine you're a crime scene investigator. You come upon a crime scene and you can collect data, maybe a fingerprint, a discarded knife, a blood stain. Those are sort of the facts, if you like, the pieces of evidence. And if they've been collected carefully, that's important, but if they've been carefully collected and documented, you can begin to build a case. But what you need as a crime scene investigator is to come up with a story that shows how all those bits of data fit together, how they can be explained. That's what a scientific model is. So Newton's law of gravity is a great example of a scientific model because it explains a broad range of observations. It explains the motion of the moon and it explains an apple falling from a tree. It explains a broad range of observations in one scientific framework. And another hallmark, as well as sort of explanatory power, is that a good scientific model will make testable predictions. In other words, you can say, look, if this theory, if this model is correct, then X or Y should be true. And then you can go out and study the real world and check to see whether X or Y really is true. And that can help to confirm or disconfirm your model. You make testable predictions. Now, of course, you don't immediately throw out a model because it fails one test. Models tend to be quite all-encompassing, and models can be modified. So what you do is you start off with a model and you test it, and then you find it doesn't explain some things, so you modify your model and you find that that explains a bit more. So that's kind of how science works. It's actually very hard when you've got a model which is well accepted and has been accepted by many scientists for a long period of time. It's hard actually to overturn a model. Certainly not one observation isn't going to be enough to overturn a model. Models are more robust than that. But they actually form the kind of framework in which you do science, in which you formulate the questions that you're then going to go out and study. So that's what models are. So let's look at an actual example of creationist model building. To lay the foundations for this, I just need to introduce you to plate tectonics. And I'm taking this example from my own discipline, from geology, because it's the one that I'm most familiar with. So you may be familiar with the concept of plate tectonics, the idea that the outer segment of the Earth, the lithosphere, is broken up into a series of rigid tectonic plates that move relative to one another. And according to plate tectonics, there are different kinds of plate boundaries. So there are boundaries where plates are spreading apart, the mid-ocean ridges, like the mid-Atlantic ridge, where hot rock is welling up from below, from the Earth's mantle, forming new ocean floor, and the ocean plates are moving apart, spreading ridges. There are other places where boundaries are convergent boundaries, where plates are moving together. And the denser plate will often dive below the overriding plate. And if there are continents attached, those continents can be brought together and collide, and that's how we form collisional mountain belts. Okay, so you have plates moving together, and then there are also plates that just kind of slide past one another. And plate tectonics is the theory that geologists use to explain a broad range of observations of the Earth's geology, and also to explain the present arrangement of continents and oceans. Now, plate tectonics is a relatively young theory. It was first developed in the 1960s, but since then it has proven to be enormously successful. It explains a huge number of observations, and it's made many useful predictions. So plate tectonics explains, for example, why, if you look at the continents on either side of the Atlantic Ocean basin, why they look as though they join up like a jigsaw puzzle. Because they once were connected, and the Atlantic Ocean has opened up and separated them. It explains the structure of the ocean floor. Why is there this big seam that runs down the middle of the oceans? That's the Mid-Atlantic Ridge or the East Pacific Rise. It explains the distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes. It explains the distribution of mountain belts, the magnetism of the ocean floor, all kinds of things. It's really successful. So today, essentially all geologists accept plate tectonics. From a creationist perspective, however, there's a problem. We can very precisely measure the rate at which plates move today using lasers, and plates typically move on the order of centimeters per year, about the rate your fingernails grow. So it would have taken, at those rates, maybe 200 million years for the Atlantic Ocean basin to open up. That's a problem, right? If as creationists we think the world is only about 10,000 years old, that's a problem. And so it's not difficult to see why many people have concluded that plate tectonics is a problem for creationism. However, over recent decades, some interesting experiments have been done looking at silicate materials. Silicate minerals are the kinds of minerals that make up the interior of the Earth, the Earth's mantle. And we can study those minerals in the laboratory under extremes of temperature and pressure. And it turns out that those silicate materials have the extraordinary ability to weaken under certain conditions of temperature and stress. They can weaken by orders of magnitude with only a few 100-degree change in temperature. So it really is quite extraordinary. They can, more than a billion-fold change in their strength when you change the temperature under which they're being deformed. And this led some scientists to begin to consider the possibility that the Earth could undergo what's called thermal runaway. So think about how this works. Imagine you've got one of these plates, one of these ocean plates, and remember I said that where plates come together, one will dive into the Earth's interior, kind of gets recycled, we call it subduction. Well, the idea is that as this plate dives, it deforms the mantle rocks. It kind of pushes the rocks around it out of the way. And as it pushes those rocks out of the way, it causes frictional heating around the diving slab. That frictional heating causes the strength of the mantle minerals to decrease. They become weaker. Well, if they become weaker, the diving plate can now dive a bit faster. And if it dives a bit faster, you get more frictional heating. And if there's more frictional heating, the mantle rocks weaken even further. And eventually you get to a kind of, through this positive feedback mechanism, you get to thermal runaway. Dr. John Baumgardner was a creationist geophysicist who was aware of this kind of work. And so in the 1980s, he decided he was going to do his PhD research studying this process. And he developed a supercomputer model that could simulate what was going on in the interior of the Earth during this process. And he concluded that under thermal runaway, tectonic plates could move not at rates of centimeters per year, but at rates of meters per second. And he was able to use his model to simulate this process and to apply it to our understanding of Earth history. And in the mid-90s, Baumgartner, along with a number of other creationist scientists, came together to propose a new version of plate tectonics, which they called catastrophic plate tectonics. So according to catastrophic plate tectonics, the movement of the Earth's tectonic plates was not a slow process, but a rapid, catastrophic process that took place during the worldwide flood in the days of Noah. So the model begins with continents and oceans. God created dry land and ocean. But the ocean floor, they say before the flood, was cold. And that means it was dense, denser than today's ocean floor, which is relatively warm. And this means that this cold ocean floor before the flood had a natural tendency to sink into the Earth's mantle, because the Earth's mantle has a similar composition, but it's warmer. So this cold, it's a bit like, a pin floating on water. What happens if you disturb the pin? It will sink, right? And the idea is that at the beginning of the flood, something caused that cold ocean floor to break away from the continents and begin to sink into the Earth's interior. As it did so, this thermal runaway process was initiated. And the plates began to sink at rates of up to sort of 1 meter per second or more. At the same time as the old ocean floor was diving into the Earth's interior, new hot rock began to well up along the mid-ocean ridges to replace the old ocean floor. Now, as this hot rock came to the surface, it is hot, it's warm, warmer than the old ocean floor it's replacing. And because it's warm, it's thermally buoyant. And in the modelling that Baumgartner did, he found that the level of the ocean floor rose by 1 kilometre or more above its pre-flood level. Now, if you raise the level of the ocean floor, what's going to happen to sea level? Sea level's going to rise. And in the model, the oceans began to flood the continents, inundating the interiors of the continents. At the same time, that hot rock was contacting cold ocean water and causing a steam jet to develop along the mid-ocean ridges. So we have these massive jets of steam ballistically ejecting water high into the Earth's atmosphere, which then would have fallen as an intense global rain. Eventually, all of the old ocean floor was consumed, and it was replaced with the new, warmer ocean floor. Because it's warmer, it's less dense, it had less of a tendency to sink, and so the process ground to a halt, or at least to the slow rates that we observe today. And as the ocean floor cooled and subsided, the ocean basins deepened and the water ran back into the ocean basins. Now, I think you can see here that what we have is a model that is based on what we understand of plate tectonics, but it also explains what happened at the time of the flood. It explains the fountains of the Great Deep, those steam jets. It explains the rain. It explains the flooding of the continents in only a few months' time. So this was a very interesting model. And one of the most exciting things, I think, as a scientist about this model is its explanatory and predictive power. So on this slide, I don't intend for you to read this, it's far too small for you to read. But what I did was I've listed in black type a whole range of things that conventional plate tectonics explains. We said it's a very successful theory. But I've also added in red type things that catastrophic plate tectonics explains that conventional plate tectonics doesn't explain. So we now have a model that explains more data than conventional plate tectonics explains. by sort of modifying it within a creationist framework. That is really impressive, that explanatory scope. And it also made some really interesting predictions that we could test. Let me give you an example. So, in conventional plate tectonics, those diving ocean plates hit a barrier in the Earth's mantle. The Earth's mantle is 2,900 kilometers deep, but there's a change in density at 670 kilometers down, and that change in density is enough that in conventional plate tectonics, where you have plates that are moving, on the order of centimeters per year, they get stuck. They can't get through this density barrier. And so in conventional plate tectonics, scientists thought that plate tectonics was going to be confined to the uppermost 670 kilometers of the Earth's interior. They thought that the plates were just going to get stuck. But in catastrophic plate tectonics, we had a very different expectation, because here you're talking about plates that are moving at meters per second. And those plates, those fast-moving plates, would have the energy to punch right through that density barrier. And so it was predicted that they would have made their way all the way down through the Earth's interior to the top of the Earth's core, right the way through the whole thickness of the mantle. These are two very different predictions. At the time, there was no way to test them, because we couldn't look inside the Earth's interior. But in the late 80s and through the 90s, a whole new discipline called seismic tomography was developed, where you can use earthquake waves to look at the Earth's interior. And scientists were astonished, because they found that sitting underneath subduction zones were cold slabs of rock that extended all the way down through the mantle to the top of the Earth's core. And what's more, these cold slabs of rock are thousands of degrees cooler than the surrounding rocks. Now this is really interesting, because not only does it look as if these plates really did have the energy to punch their way down through the mantle, but they haven't warmed up. They're still relatively cool compared to the surrounding mantle. If they've been down there for 100 million years, they should have reached a thermal equilibrium with the mantle. There shouldn't be a temperature difference. But there is. They're still cold. So this implies that they were moving faster, and they got down there not all that long ago. This is really interesting. This is exciting. This is direct confirmation of the predictions of a creationist model. Now, given the time, I had got another example of a prediction that was confirmed, but we'll skip that, I think, because hopefully that's sort of made the point. So let's come on then to the big questions in creation biology. So I've been talking about geology. There are lots of other examples we could have looked at. We could have looked at research going on in biology, where all of these different sort of areas of biology, there is model building going on from a creationist perspective. I wanted to point out some things about these creationist models that I think are important to say. Notice that building these kinds of creationist models offers a positive approach to the data. In other words, the data is there to be explained, not to be explained away. There's always a tendency, isn't there, when you come across inconvenient data to sort of ignore it or overlook it, or to pretend that it isn't there. But when you're building models, you're forced to engage with the data as it really is. And I think this is really important about creationist model building. It concentrates our minds on having to explain what we really observe in the world. Another point about these models, you may have noticed, plate tectonics being a case in point, how similar a creationist model can be to its conventional counterpart. Okay? It is not true, as some of our critics like to claim, that if you want to be a creationist, you've got to throw out 99% of modern science. That isn't true. Very often what we find ourselves doing as creationists is adopting 99% of modern science, but modifying it in interesting ways. So in plate tectonics, what happens, under conditions of thermal runaway? What does that do? And you come up with a completely new model that actually explains more than the old model. So they can actually be quite similar in many respects. And thirdly, notice how creationists in many ways aren't doing science any differently to their secular counterparts. We do science the same way. We formulate hypotheses, collect data, we do field work, we do lab experiments, we do computer simulations, we formulate models, we try to test them, we publish. This is all just the work of science. So what's different? Well, what's different are the questions we're asking. As creationists, because we have a different worldview, very often the questions we will ask will be questions that just don't occur to people who are operating within a different kind of framework. We're asking new questions, and new questions lead us to new discoveries. And that's also really exciting. And it means that, this is good for science. We're doing things that nobody else is doing. So to sum up then, building our own scientific models is undoubtedly harder, more challenging than simply poking holes in evolution. But in the long run, I think it's more likely to be productive. Not only scientifically, but as I said earlier, in terms of apologetics. This is compelling. If we can explain the data better, that's quite exciting. Secondly, I want to ask the question, what if some of these creationist models are wrong? I think sometimes Christians are a bit concerned about that. Yeah, we can do this model building, but what if we turn out to be wrong? What if catastrophic plate tectonics isn't correct? Does that jeopardize our faith in the Bible and its account of a global flood? Well, I would say no. Our scientific models are not scripture. Right? We want our scientific models to be consistent with the Bible, but scientific models are not the Bible. So let's say catastrophic plate tectonics turns out to be completely incorrect. That doesn't remotely change the biblical teaching about a worldwide flood. It just means that we need to do more work to find out what the real sort of solution is, what the real, to come up with a better model. And I've already said, surely science is enriched because creationists are doing this kind of work. We are making new discoveries because we're asking questions and collecting data, doing research that nobody else is doing, because we have a different set of questions to ask, and that's good for science. Finally, I don't want to leave you with the idea that as creationists we've kind of got it all sewn up, that we've answered all the questions, that we kind of know everything. In fact, as we do this research, it raises loads more questions. We find that, as you do research, you solve one problem or you answer one question, you raise a whole lot of other questions. There's loads of things that we don't know, lots of unanswered questions, lots of research we haven't done. We could achieve an enormous amount if we had more people doing this work. We're a small community. We don't have any resources. Nobody gives us government grants to do research. Nobody employs us to do this kind of work, really. We're a small community. We have no resources, and we haven't been doing this for very long. What I would say is that given all of those limitations, what we've been able to achieve is absolutely remarkable. And to me, it's a signpost that says, this is really worth thinking about. This is really worth pursuing. There really is something here. This is not a fool's errand. As has already been mentioned, if you want to sort of read more about creationist model building, you can pick up my book or Faith, Form and Time, book by Kurt Wise, which is also very helpful. And there's just a reminder of the podcast, where we also sort of focus on model building. Quite often it's a conversation between me and Todd about some aspect of creation research, but very often we also bring on guests, experts in their various disciplines to tell us about the research that they're doing. So do check out the podcast, do subscribe. If you're on YouTube, just click the subscribe button, and that really helps us to sort of reach a bigger audience with all of this. Thank you very much. I'm going to finish there.